So our format is, it's very intentional, very informal, right? You're gonna see some of us eating. We'll be laughing. I might start swearing about others, but I might start doing that. Um, we'll mostly just kind of talk around some questions around ethnic studies, and as Jen said, towards the end, we'll really open the space for some questions if you have them. But this is a very informal space, very purposely as a pedagogical practice of ethnic studies. So at that, I'm gonna say Amanda.
Hey y'all, good morning. As Jeff said, we are members of Washington Ethnic Studies now. We call ourselves WASN for short, especially if you didn't know how you would pronounce W-A-E-S-N, it's WASN. And we are a group of educators, community members and activists, parents and family members, and most importantly, students who are working to get ethnic studies into the classrooms and education of all the students in Washington state. And we are also, we work with educators from outside of the state as well who are interested in bringing that to those spaces. Our group was actually originally started by a smaller group of educators, Tracy Castro-Gill, Almo Alonso, Jennifer Dunn. They met with educator Curtis Acosta, who you may recognize that name from the Fight for Ethnic Studies in Arizona, which they won. And we wanted to get guidance and learn from the things that happened there so that we could have a stronger implementation here in Washington state. So that's our mission. For more information, definitely visit our website, waethnicstudies.com. And then we're also going to introduce ourselves. I'm Amanda Hubbard. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the board president for WASN, but more importantly, I work in K-5 education in Seattle Public Schools. This year, I'm working with English language learners in their language development, but I might be heading back to the classroom someday soon. And then I'll pass it to Shraddha, and I really hope that I got your name right this time. I listened to that clip a lot.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Shraddha Sharude. I am the Secretary Director of Washington Ethnic Studies now. A little bit about me is that I am an Indian American woman. I immigrated here when I was a little kid. I teach at Garfield High School. I'm a math teacher there. And I have a cat named Fibonacci who will be joining us today. I'm going to pass it to Jeff.
I'm Jeff Stowe. I'm one of the board of directors for WASN. I also work up at Ethnic Studies. I work up at Edmonds, where I push social studies and ethnic studies throughout the district. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Rob. Good to see you here. Yeah. I'll pass it on to Teacher of the Year, Brooke Brown.
Thank you. Really, we're all Teachers of the Year. Let's be real. This is a year like no other. So I see all of you working super hard. So yeah, so I'm a member of WASN, and I am Washington State Teacher of the Year. Really exciting to just really push a lot of the things that all of us have been working on. So humbled and excited to continue on in this work with this amazing group of people I get the privilege to learn from. So a little bit about me. I work at Washington High School in the Franklin Pierce School District. I teach English and ethnic studies. I identify as a biracial Black woman, and I use she, her pronouns. Okay, I'm gonna pass it to Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin Herda. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a white cis woman, not women, just one. I teach ethnic studies at the 7th grade in Tukwila. And I will pass, and I'm on the board of directors for WASN, and I'll pass to John.
Hey everybody, my name is John Greenberg, he, him, white American. I'm an aspiring ethnic studies educator because I don't think I'm ever going to fully be there, but I'm just going to continue to try to do better to embody ethnic studies. I'm treasurer for WASN, and I'm also a youth coordinator for the NAACP Youth Council, which is a primarily BIPOC youth-led organization that is working for racial equity in Washington State. So I'm gonna put some of that information in the chat so you can check it out. But ethnic studies is about centering students, especially students of color. And so there's groups that you can partner with, and especially in this remote way. So a little bit about me. And then Amanda, did you talk about yourself individually?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I covered that. But I do want to go, I was typing this in the chat, but I'm just going to say it now. I want to shout out that the WASN as an organization was founded largely by women of color. The election results was largely driven by women of color. And so if you've been working in isolation and you identify in that way, like, join us. We are powerful, we are warm and inviting, and we want you here with us.
I think we wanted to start the conversation officially, I don't know, something. And like Jeff said, our goal is to kind of keep it real with you all, and kind of just speak the way that we do with each other. So I'm just going to respond to what Amanda was actually just said, because it was on my heart too. And it was just about how so much of this work, it feels like it's done in isolation because majority of our teaching task force is white. And so, like, I'll just pose a question to the group, I suppose, is how can we possibly turn ethnic studies into a movement if most of our teaching workforce is white?
I feel like as we work for systemic change to hire more educators of color, I also like that's happening always. But I also feel like the white educators, it's our responsibility to also engage with ethnic studies. This is not something that only educators of color should be doing. We should all be doing it in all of our spaces. And so that idea that as a white male, you know, it's in Edmonds, it's always a little awkward. I'm pushing the work in Edmonds, right, as a white male, but I recognize that it's a temporary spot for me. There'll be a change at some point where I step out of the way, but I think everybody should be doing the work. Everybody should be pushing this agenda.
And if I can add, Jeff, are you done? I didn't want to cut you off. Okay. I would just add that so much of ethnic studies, it's what we teach, but it's how we teach. And to be able to enter the conversation is to understand the power dynamics at play, and to really understand that your positionality as a teacher, and just to really understand that. And so part of ethnic studies is about decolonizing the power structure in our classroom. So yes, my name is on the door. Like 303 is my classroom, but I don't acknowledge it as my classroom. It's our classroom. So I share it with my students, and they have just as much sort of license in my classroom to engage in what we're learning in. And so when we're starting to develop curriculum, I'm always thinking, I never can settle on what we're doing exactly, because it's shifting, it's alive, it's dependent on who's in the seats in front of me. And I'll just share this experience with you. I had the privilege to study American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington. And that was the first time as a student of color, I didn't read stories about people that looked like me. I read the canon when I was in high school. And I'll tell you, I love to read. Like, I have bookshelves, like 1.5 in each room of my house. Like, books are everywhere. And I love the way that literature can take us into different places and help us understand different people and different cultures. And I didn't get that experience in high school. So what does that tell me about where I'm from? And what does that tell me about my culture or my identity? It says I don't matter. And so for me, my first experience really having that aha moment to read a book was reading Their Eyes Were Watching God.
Yeah, once you guys are ready.
It was in college, And let me tell you, I went to the University of Washington. That university is not very diverse. Okay, when I went there, there was less than 3% African American students. And when we think about, when you boil that down to how many students were international students from the continent of Africa, how many students were athletes, how many students were there just as students. Okay, so when we're looking at less than 3%, that's not indicative of the population. So I was in my very first African American studies class, or it was Harlem Renaissance, and I walked in and my teacher was white. And so the most students of color in any of my classes as a freshman at UW were sitting with us, and we're all kind of looking at each other like, this is interesting. And let me tell you, when she walked in the room and she saw our quiz faces, she did not take that personally. She owned it. And she said, the very first thing out of her mouth was, you might be wondering why I'm your teacher of Harlem Renaissance. And she owned it. And so she understood her positionality. And I have to tell you, her name is Dr. Pamela Ralston. She no longer teaches at the University of Washington, but she was imperative to my learning, and she owned her positionality. And so it gave us an opportunity to engage with her on an authentic level. And so I think really it is imperative, whatever race you are as a teacher, that you are interrogating your positionality as the educator in the room, and that you're continuing to do the inside work and then owning that. Because I think students, what they want, what we have always wanted, is that authenticity, is that we don't need perfection, right? None of us in here are perfect. And ethnic studies does not call us to be perfect. Ethnic studies calls us to continue to pursue the counter narrative, to continue to pursue healing, to continue to include everyone in what we're learning, so we can really be reimagining a brighter future together, and embracing this idea of loving ourselves and loving one another, and getting to the holistic experience of all of us.
And then I want to jump in because I don't know if there are really elementary educators in this space. But if you're here, what I would say is, like, at the elementary level, that is absolutely possible, is absolutely the way that I enter into the space. At elementary, you learn how many things don't necessarily come naturally, and how many things you are kind of responsible for helping students to understand, right? Like, I remember sending third graders off with the direction like, okay, you're gonna go to small groups, you're gonna have a discussion. What questions do you have before you go and do that? And one of my third graders raises his hand, and I'm like, yes. And what do you think? What's your question, dear? And he's like, yeah, I think that's gonna be great. What is discussion? And I was like, oh shit. What? Okay, how many of you agree that you would also like to know the answer to Marcos's question? And they were all like, ooh, that's a really good question. Like, they were all like, we would also like to know that. And so, like, at the elementary level, it is about modeling and showing how much you value their knowledge, their input. It's about flattening that hierarchy, and I explicitly teach my students that their strongest teachers are often going to be their peers and their classmates, and that if they're relying on getting a quote-unquote right answer and validation from an adult, then they are more focused on a result than they are on the learning. And the learning is what happens when we are exploring and in conversation with each other. And I am one person, and so that conversation cannot be with just me. It has to be also with your classmates, with your peers, because if you're gonna sit and wait to have only meaningful conversations with the adult in the room, then I am so sorry to tell you, children, some of you might wait forever, because that is what happens with implicit bias. That is what happens when we start to notice the patterns of who gets kicked out of our classes, out of our classmates, who are the ones who we see the least, right? And they can name it, they know it. They'll even say it when they're in small group and you've assigned a student who has been like pulled out or kicked out of class over and over again because we're policing them. And the student will be like, oh, do we have another partner? Because like they're never here. and they're not even being mean about it. They're not even expressing judgment. They're just like, how do I work with a person who's not here? And so it is up to us to interrogate our practices. And what I think of it as is I think of it as figuring out how to live your values. Like, students are so in touch with like whether or not you're being authentic. It'll never be enough for you to slap that Black Lives Matter shirt on, or like put a sticker on your shirt if you didn't even cough up the money to get one, right? Like, they know if that actually matters to you, because they know if you actually talk about it outside of that one day that you wore your sticker, they know it. And they know, and they can name the teachers who have these conversations with them, and they can name the teachers who own their shit, and they keep themselves accountable. They keep themselves in a learner mindset, which involves humility. And they say that, like, it is quite possible, and in fact, most likely true, that a young Black 8-year-old boy is going to know more about the Black experience in the US, in Seattle, than me. And for me, that's as a mixed race Filipina person. And that is okay. It's more than okay. It is wonderful that now this student can be positioned as someone who has really valuable and important knowledge. And so elementary is so much about developing that identity and that understanding that we value you, your voice, and that it matters, and not because the teacher said so, but because I am learning to understand myself. I am learning to understand and empathize with the other students in my classroom who maybe I didn't understand before. And I am explicitly practicing holding value for other people's perspectives, sides of the story. And it's not about being right or wrong. It's about learning to love and understand each other better.
You know, and I think the words that keep coming into my head are like transparency, vulnerability, authentic, community, and positionality. Like you have to like really embrace a lot of these things. And I think, you know, being transparent with students about your positionality helps them then kind of figure out their own positionality as well. And naming it and talking about it in the spaces helps students connect into the classroom community and start to see themselves as part of the community instead of just, this is Miss Herda's class and I'm a student. Like you're trying to take away that I'm the teacher, you're the student. Like one of the students said they were late to class in virtual learning, but they were late to class because the teacher said, I tell you when to leave, you don't leave because your next class starts. And I was just like, that's not, we're breaking away from that. We need to break away from my rules or you're out. I had like students got kicked out of my daughter's class for writing in the chat. Like the teacher kicked them out of class in distance learning for talking in the, or spamming the chat, you know? So it's just like learning how to like take away our authority view, the authoritarian view, and bring it into this community view that we're all doing this together and we're all the teachers of the classroom.
I feel like that brings in the, you know, you're talking about all these little small things, and I've heard us talk multiple times about perspectives, and that kind of leans into that curriculum side of things, right? Of like, what is ethnic studies? And it isn't just like, let me hand you some materials, let's put some Black and brown folks in your slide decks. Like, it's so much more than that. And some of the stuff we've already talked about really leans into it. And it's really more about like the way that we live our lives. Like that is ethnic studies. It is a way of life. It is the ways in which we accept knowledge, and it's the ways in which we believe validity.
I think when we're we're talking about curriculum and we're talking about pedagogy in our classrooms, it's what we teach as well as how we teach it. And so I think it's really important to remember, just like Sharada said, it's not just adding more Black and brown folks to our slides. That's part of it. That's the first step. But if we just do that, we've missed the mark. And so it's really important. I always think about Jeff Duncan Andrade when he talks about how my Black and brown students in Parkland are different than the Black and brown students he teaches in Oakland, that are different from the Black and brown students in Washington, D.C. And so really understanding that it's not enough to just be culturally relevant, but we need to be community relevant. We need to reflect who is in our classroom and who is in our spaces, and all of those discretionary moments in class. Like, we have an opportunity either to validate students and encourage them to keep contributing, or we can shut them down. And so part of it is being really intentional every day and every interaction. How am I validating the students in my class? How am I interacting with them? How am I ensuring that the place that they enter to learn is safe, is brave, I would say actually, is a brave space, is a place that they feel like they could have the opportunity to bring their whole selves. As a BIPOC woman educator, I don't have the opportunity to only bring part of myself. I show up every day 100% of who I am, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And my students want to do the same. And so ethnic studies to me is so much about not just how I teach, or not just what I teach, but also how I teach it. How am I making sure that it's not just me delivering curriculum, but my students are engaged in the process? How do I make sure that they're reflected in what we're studying, and being open to ask their opinion, like, what do you want to cover? How can we continue to learn together? How can they do research with their peers and then share it with one another, and they become the teacher in the classroom, not tokenizing their cultural experience, but connecting to it, validating it, and sharing it. How many opportunities have students had before my classroom to do oral history interviews of their family in their native language? And they ask, like, do I have to translate it? No, there's trust conveyed. I'm not having this thought of like, oh, maybe you're not. No, yes, bring that here. It's welcome in this space because that's you. And so I just think it's this centering of their experience. It's their validation that their culture matters, that they are an integral part of this classroom. And because they're here, the classroom is better for it. Our class experience is better because each one is there. And I'm consistently learning from them. And I think the other thing just to add is that ethnic studies cannot be done in a vacuum. We cannot do it together because this is hard work. I always think of NPSI and thinking about how this is a marathon. And so every day I'm going to continue to learn. Every day by what podcasts I'm listening to, by who I'm following on Twitter, by what movies I decide to watch, or what books I decide to purchase. Those are all a deposit into what I have access to be able to express or discuss with my students. And so every time I focus intentionally on increasing my understanding of other students or other people's culture, that's me validating them. That's me saying they matter. And so how are we using our free time? And especially in the pandemic, when there's not a whole lot of it, it becomes even more important. And really understanding there's so many experts that are availing themselves right now and having opportunities. So, can I, during a lunch break, catch a virtual book club? Last Wednesday, they had Patrisse Cullors was on sharing her YA new adaptation of When They Call You a Terrorist. Like, read that, it's so good. And it's free. Like, you just show up and you have all of these experts that are just sharing their wealth of knowledge, and you can show up and learn and just keep learning. And when you connect with one another, you realize that you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to get it right every time, but you do have to own your impact. And so really understanding, like, we have good intent, but I need people to call me on things because I make mistakes. And even if my intent is good, I need people in community that will say, Brooke, you missed the mark. And then I have to have the humility to say, you know what? Yes, you're right. How can I do better? How can I apologize and then continue to move forward? Because nobody expects us to be perfect, but we do need to continue to get better for our students.
just on a side note, but not really, just like emphasizing Brooke's last statement for me is the apologies. My students are always so surprised. They're like dead silent when I apologize. And I asked them one time, I was like, when I'm apologizing, like, why does nobody say anything? And my students were like, well, what do you want us to say? I was like, I don't know. What are you thinking? And you know, like when I have these students second time around. And so I was like, you know, I didn't really apologize much last year. I would make mistakes and I'd be like, oh, that's my bad, guys. And that was really all I would do, but I would never own the impacts that I had. It was those kind of half apologies because I'm uncomfortable with the fact that I made a mistake, and just acknowledging it should have been enough in my mind. And looking back on it, like, no, you can't just be like, oh, my bad. I expressed some anti-Blackness in that moment. Like, you don't get to just say my bad. You also have to do that work of repairing the harm, which is for you really uncomfortable and painful. And as an educator, what it meant was putting my curriculum on hold and having a conversation with my students and owning my impact and saying, y'all, I fucked up. I did. I'm sorry. This was what, you know, like saying like, this was not my intention, but here's my understanding of what happened. Can you either confirm or deny that, right? Like, can you confirm that I was told that this was the feelings that were felt? And I'm not starting with my intent. I start with my impact, because to start with your intent centers yourself. So when you say, you know, like, for example, if you were to teach a lesson, I'll give one example of a bad experience that I had, and that was at a teacher training for new teachers a couple years ago. And the training had all of these images in media of ways that we have tokenized Black suffering. And this is me saying it lightly because I just don't want to talk about it too much. And it was so painful and harmful to look around the room and see how people were surprised by this and who had never seen these things and what have you. And when I spoke to the facilitators about it, their first response was not, I apologize. Their first response is, well, we wanted people to be aware, you know, like we didn't mean to hurt you, but. And so what that does in that moment is it centers who they are, their whiteness, their intent, and I have to sit there and hear it and pretend like my opinion really mattered, like what I was saying really mattered to them. And then they later tried to bring me in and talk to me and try to, you know, ask me for how they could do better. But at that point I was like, you don't want to do better. You just want to feel better. If you want to do better, then you start with the impact and you say, I hurt you. Can you tell me more about how I hurt you? And you're not always going to get a yes, but if you start with that, then you're actually doing that counter narrative that we talk about in ethnic studies, right? We're talking about counter narratives. And when you have power in a moment and you center yourself or your feelings, you continue to perpetuate the master narratives. And part of ethnic studies is decolonizing your approach to life. And huge aspects of it, when you start decentering yourself and decentering your colonial white supremacist internalized flaws, that means that you start with impact.
And I think like to tie it like with how ethnic studies works, like what you just said reminds me of how like the whole, I'm trying to get the right words for it, but it's ethnic studies empowers students in all of their interactions, not just seeing themselves in curriculum, but in the ability to tell their teacher, like, you messed up, right? And it helps so much that like it in Tukwila, we really teach the framework as the themes, and we call out the themes everywhere. So where are you seeing identity? Where are you seeing power and oppression? Where are you seeing liberation and resistance? And really trying to get them to embrace that this is like the way we view the world. It's not the way we are in the class. And Brooke, I don't know if you said it this time or if you said it in the first session, but like what happens in my classroom has to leave the classroom. And I was so excited when you said that, because I say the exact same thing in my classroom. Like, what I teach you does absolutely no good unless you go do something with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I just want to add about ethnic studies. So I just want to just make sure that we're really focused on when Erin was talking about kind of the framework. So we're looking at kind of the themes of ethnic studies, but it's really important that we're not just problem admirers. We're not just talking about the things that have been done to people of color, to marginalized populations. We need to make sure that we're talking about joy. We need to make sure that we're talking about liberation and survival. And when we think about the undercut, ethnic studies is more than multicultural education. It's about in looking at how power is manifested in the system. For so many of my students, when we talk about racism, they think about racial slurs or interpersonal racism. But part of what we need to understand is systemic, it's institutional. And how does that work and how does that show up in their lives? And really undercutting, though, it's not just about continuing to bombard them with all the ways that they've been marginalized or oppressed, because that's a depressing class. No, I don't want to attend that class. But what I do want to attend is to understand how power works, how the system is set up, so that I can heal, so we can heal, so we can have that collective understanding, so we can historicize how we got here today. We're reading Stamped right now in class, and I think it's so good to have that understanding and really unpack how ideas have translated over time, so we don't have to talk about people. Like, if you know someone who subscribes to those ideas, I'm never going to talk bad about that person, and you don't have to either. But we can talk about some ideas that they have and the consequences that happen when people have those ideas. But the beauty of it is we can love people unconditionally and disagree with their ideas, and ideas can be unlearned. And so part of what you learn here has to leave here is you start to learn how to flex those muscles of having those critical conversations. How can we have a conversation about something that's meaningful and disagree and still be respectful? There's certain things that I'm not going to argue about as truth or untruth, but can we still engage in conversations and be able to critically think about it for ourselves? And that's my goal. I never want to teach my students what to think. I want to teach them how to think. I want them to look at situations today and be able to say, whose perspective is missing? How is this the whole story? Or are there other people who I need to hear what they have to say? And so I think it's really important that we make sure that we do look at power. It's not multicultural education by just adding more people of color's voices. That's the first step. We need to interrogate power. That's another step. But we need to not stop there. We can't just look at how problems persist and how they show up. We need to talk about liberation and healing. And so the part of the class that's always necessary is, now that we know it, how can we actively engage in our community? Because we didn't all collectively have, nobody's responsible for where we are today, but we're all responsible for where we're going to end up. And so how do we show up? How do we have care and compassion? And how do we cultivate the gifts that each one of us has to make the space around us better? And how do we empathize with one another and show up for each other? Because that's really what I want my students to leave the class with.
I think that's the elephant in the room, though, for a lot of educators, is going back to something that Shraddha said earlier, is that you have to embody it everywhere. I think many people have said that, but like, a lot of educators are about compliance. It's a majority white in Washington State. It's an 89% white, and they're people who love school. They're not used to challenging systems. And so the elephant to me is like, you have to embody challenging the system and putting yourself, and I guess this is more to the white educators, if they're there, is that you have to put yourself in the line of fire. And I don't think a lot of folks are willing to do that. And if you're not willing to do that, it's hard for you to really teach ethnic studies, because it's all about challenging the system. The whole reason this movement has been galvanized is so much because of the youth taking action in Tucson. And so if you want to be anti-racist, you have to practice being anti-racist. You can't get good at it if you don't practice. And so I'm not sure how many educators are willing to do that, white educators especially.
I was just thinking along the same line, like the self-work that goes into being an ethnic studies educator is really, really crucial. Like, you will cause harm if you don't do the self-work first, because you won't know when you're harming people when you don't do the self-work first. And that it's a constant cycle of self-work. You're never done. You've never hit, like when John said he's an aspiring ethnic studies teacher, I've learned from John before I even met John, because I knew his story of what happened to him when he was teaching in Seattle and like the consequences he faced. That was taught in my program, in my master's in teaching program, John's story. So to hear somebody that I wanted to be like when I grew up talk about how he's still evolving as a teacher helps me know that I keep going too, right? That I have to keep learning and I don't get to stop and say I've reached that moment. You know, somebody explained it to me once that this work is like, you think you've gotten to the summit of the mountain and then you look up and there's another peak and you just have to keep going. And when you think you're done, that's when you're going to cause harm. So I think you're right, John. I think that it's like, who is getting all of our white educators to really do the self-work, to make them see the importance of doing the self-work and to break away from the status quo and push back. And I think it's what you said right there with the educators, the families of color in Seattle, that said, we don't need you to be perfect, we need you to be courageous. And I think that is my role as a white educator, is to be courageous and push back on the policies and push back on the decision making in my building and in my district to start making those changes.
I know that we've said like it's a lot of work and like you got to do the work. I think it's also really important to point out that this work is joyous. And like once you let go of needing the world to be the way that it's been for you in your mind, and you really open yourself up to the fact that there can be multiple things that are true at the same time, and as Brooke pointed out for her classroom, right? Like you didn't make this problem, but we are responsible for it. And so it's so much more freeing. And from my perspective anyway, it was so much more freeing to realize that like this wasn't because of individual choices, that this wasn't because of anything like that was particularly like targeted at me, Amanda Hubbard, but that this was something bigger and systemic, and that and more importantly, that there are communities and have always been communities that are fighting to change this, and that you can be part of them. At Wasson, we offer so many opportunities to connect people because as I hope we said in this presentation, this is not something that you do alone. You'll burn out, you just will. And so you have to find those allies in your school buildings, and sometimes you don't know who they are, and so maybe your first step is like, how do I suss out an ally for myself, just one other person who might be interested in like being part of this journey? Or maybe if that's like too daunting, absolutely check us out. We have PLCs every month that you can join, where you can think through your practice and like the things that you want to be different for your students and for yourself, and you'll be able to come up with like action steps. You'll be able to connect with other educators that will inspire you and will support you. So absolutely check out our PLCs. And just in terms of like wanting you to feel like you have some tools to like start to engage in these courageous conversations in shifting your practice and your pedagogy, we also offer a 9-module series that really, really would be impactful for, oh wait.
No, I was not even invited to Charlotte's wedding.
Hey, Lauren, you're muted.
Okay, that was not.
Cool. And so I offer these things not because like we're trying to plug our organization, but we are because we're wonderful, personal opinion, but also because we are a community of learners. Like I know Erin is enrolled in these modules, I'm enrolled in these modules, like Brooke is, I'm going to be going at 3:00 today for module 3. Like these are things that we are seeking out, right? We're not hoping and waiting for something inspirational to like come across mainstream media. We are seeking out the opportunities to understand our world better so that we can then show up and be better and stronger for our students.
I'm going to add one last anecdote because I know we're running out on time. And the whole time we were speaking, all I could think about was my nephew. I'm a brand new auntie as of last week, first in our family, like super exciting. And this conversation really reminded me of him because my nephew's parents are very data-driven, very scientific, very tech-savvy, right? They're very American in their ways of knowing because, well, we're Americans. We live in America. That's our way of knowing. And that alluded to a lot of stress the first week of his life because the baby comes in and everything you know is no longer making sense. And all I can say is, as hard as it has been for them, every time I speak with them, they say that this is the best thing that's ever happened to them in their life. And it's the biggest joy they could have possibly had. No matter how hard it is, no matter how painful it seems, they would not trade it for the world because they can't even picture their world without this child. And I completely agree. And as dorky as it sounds, it's what was going through my mind when talking about ethnic studies, because it's extremely hard and extremely painful, but you wouldn't have it any other way because your world would not be this way without ethnic studies. It changes your life for the better. And you want to cry and you feel like you're going to die at moments. And then something good happens and you're just like, this is the best thing in the entire freaking world. And I would not trade it for anything. And then you talk to somebody else who also just had a child or who's ever had a child, and they're like, oh, absolutely, I understand completely. And suddenly your friend group starts growing and growing and growing. And it changes your life to a point where you will never look back because you couldn't see this world being any other way. And without community, you might not have realized that it gets better and better and better. And so just thinking about that anecdote, I really hope that we continue to see you all in our spaces because you're about to have your life change for the best. And like all it takes is that one step of deciding that this is what I want in my life. And we hope to see you in those spaces to start growing yourself through our professional development series. And we hope that you will join us during our PLCs and our monthly meetings where we can do this together and just bring more joy into this world. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate you being here today.